power bill. There's just so many ways that we can reconstruct how we're financing this government and make it work for our people. Or we can forego all of those opportunities and incur this kind of an opportunity cost where we're using these tax increases to just further subsidize bad practices of this government. Whether it's property tax increases, whether it's business privilege tax increases, there's so many things we could have done that we're not going to do because instead we're having to use those tax increases for these purposes. So, I mean, that's just another aspect that we're not looking at when we're talking about tax increases. It's not just a matter of us getting to the next fiscal year and getting the fiscal year after that. You know, when we sit down and we develop fiscal policy and we weigh something as dramatic as tax increases, is there ways that we can get a better result for our people having committed these kind of investments into bigger purposes than just continuing business as usual? So it's just, those are all the things that are weighing on my mind, Mr. Speaker. I'm not trying to be obstinate. I'm not trying to just, you know, get in the way of trying to pass a budget. But we're really in a very, we're in the middle of a massive sea change here on our island. Leadership, policy, everything across the board. The less inclined we are to continue business as usual, the more we can render results for our people that have been a long time coming. So I support repealing this provision. I think that we can definitely figure out how to come up with this funding through other avenues, and definitely, if not through that, at least acknowledge the fact that this revenue won't even come in until February. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we can have a new administration with different ideas or different priorities and move forward of coming up with filling the shortfall in other ways. So I rise in support of the amendment, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. And just for the colleagues, according to the OPA report, the average loss per year non-collected because of various issues, either uncollected delinquencies, John Doe's, escape assessment, or was about $4 million too. And the other
tax is placed in the budget bill. And so the question is this increase only for the one fiscal year? I mean, is that the intent here? Because if the intent, I believe, is to increase it permanently going forward, then we would need to make an amendment to existing law and reflect the changes in there. And so I need to at least ask that question, because if I take this at face value without any amendment to existing law in terms of what the real estate tax rate is, then I assume that this tax increase is just for the fiscal year 2019.
Your question is very well taken. Yes, the way that it is written, it was the intent to carry forward, but you're correct that if that was the intent, I stand to be corrected by legal as to whether or not the way that it's written, it would be able to survive past the fiscal year. But right now, it's just it's to provide for the revenue for this fiscal year with the intention of it going forward. But if it's inartfully written and incorrectly written that it should be an amendment to 4104 or whatever the sections are and make it specific, then we will have to make that amendment at some later time. But right now, all it was to get through this budget and then see whether or not we're going to do it. We'll see whether or not we're required to do that, to carry it forward.
To carry forward, just even
past this fiscal year.
Past the fiscal year. Yeah. Okay. So right now we can assume that this is only a one year
it could be read
in
that
property
way.
tax, because there is that possibility that perhaps the economy could turn, and with the military realignment, the revenues could be different going into 2020, and there may not be a need to perpetuate the increased taxes on real estate going forward. I mean, that's what I'm assuming could be a possible scenario as to why we're only doing it for 1 year.
That interpretation has some validity.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Speaker,
Go ahead, you're first, and then you.
can we just, the previous speaker said that we could assume it's for fiscal year 2019. But because this is such a serious issue that weighs heavily on the backs of the people, if we could get clarification now, the impact of the way it is written is only going to include this fiscal year 2019, please.
Okay, that's well taken, and I will ask your issue.
Similar, Mr. Speaker, this is what I had raised with legal. The same thing is that this language is written, same thing with the BPT increase. It doesn't change the code section that sets this out by code as to what the tax rates are. And your title that we passed earlier says, you know, appropriations to pay for fiscal year 19. It's the General Appropriations Act of 2019. So I think it is unclear. I mean, it looks like it's intending to be permanent. And if anyone's thinking that it's temporary, then I agree that it should be clarified. I'm also questioning, at the end of the bill, we have appropriations for 2018, whereas our title says 2019. But, so I just want that to be clarified. I think it's better if we just, it should be a code section that's amended, so there are no questions, and you put it in with your miscellaneous provisions, or wherever we have other changes to law that are intended to be permanent, Mr. Speaker.
We'll take a short recess. The legislature's back in order. I have spoken to legal counsel, and the opinion of the legal counsel is the way that it's written currently is ambiguous, and that we don't have the protection that we had in 3487, where there was a sunset provision. The compiler of laws did go back and amend the law, but with the understanding that there was a sunset provision on September 31st for that 5%. With the way that this thing is written, it isn't clear, and so we are preparing an amendment to make it sunset at the end of the fiscal year, and it'd be one fiscal year. It would then give, as some of you have been insisting on, the opportunity for whoever is the new governor to decide whether or not, since all of them is now, we will have done our responsibility by making it clear that it is just for the 1 year and ending on at the end of September the 31st, 2019. But first we have to, and I thank Senator Espaldon for bringing it to our attention. And if he would just review this amendment and see if he would be willing to do it. And we'll continue with the discussion with Senator Esteves' amendment on the real property. Any other senator wish to be heard on the Esteves amendment on Madam Vice Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the sentiments of my colleagues that this section of the bill increasing BPT and the amendment that we are discussing right now, which discusses this increase, the proposed increase in the real property tax, it's come, well, the discussion is that it's necessary in order to make up for the loss from the tax changes that were made by Congress. But those tax changes really affected businesses a lot more, corporations a lot more than they affected the individual taxpayers, gave much more benefits to businesses. And however, these taxes that the bill proposes to put into place really really penalize all individual taxpayers, working families especially, and those are lower income, I think are disproportionately impacted. I think that the mover of the amendment to delete the increase in real property tax makes an important point regarding the protection of land. And I just wanted to put it on the record that that protection of land, I think, was a very wise policy. It grew not because, people like to come into the legislature and say, oh my goodness, what's wrong with the people of Guam? We have the lowest real property taxes in the world. But maybe they don't know our history, Mr. Speaker, and I think our history is very clear and legislatures before us made it very clear that it was their policy to preserve land for the people of Guam, to not separate them from their land. And they had reason to do that, and I have an excerpt that I just wanted to read into the record. It's from it's quoted again in Guampedia, but it was a study that was done on land on Guam, the history of land, and it was also published, I think, in the book that you were also published in, Mr. Speaker. And it talks about land policies on Guam and how the people of Guam were separated from their land because they were unable to pay the taxes that were imposed, first of all, by the Spanish. I'm sorry. Let me just read this, Mr. Speaker. It says in 1899, Captain Richard Leary abolished the old Spanish tax system and implemented a new land tax, the schedule of tariffs for the island of Guam, whereas the Spanish real estate tax had been based on the money earned from the use of the property. Leary's tax system was based on the size and type of land. The new rates proved so burdensome so as to cause Chamorros to lose their land to the naval government. Furthermore, this policy led landowners who feared losing their property to understate the size and value of their land. Leary then issued General Order Number 15, warning landowners to register their land by 15 May 1899 if they wanted their ownership recognized. The order also stated that the taxes would be due in July. Thus began what former Guam Senator Richard F. Taitano termed the Crown landization of Chamorro lands, the conversion of privately owned lands into Spanish Crown lands. The naval government concluded that all land not registered by the May 15 deadline would be considered Spanish Crown land. These lands were subsequently acquired by the U.S. through the imposition of taxes and other means. General Order Number 15 forced the Chamorros to make a choice, either register their properties accurately and lose them because they could not pay the taxes, or not register their lands and lose them because they could not pay the taxes, or not register their lands and lose them because they were not properly registered. Many Chamorros who owned parcels in the villages as well as farmlands in rural areas had to decide which lots to save. When the naval government began finding mistakes in the declaration of the lot sizes, it began registering the lands as government property. And it goes on. And then it talks about after the war. And after the war, and again, Mr. Speaker, I'm reading just these short excerpts just to show the wisdom of the policy that has been in place for many, many years. After the war, when the Navy was again put in charge of island affairs, the appointed governor immediately began condemning huge tracts of land, including whole villages. The U.S. had flattened portions of Guam during the intense bombing, and now the naval government began changing the landscape of the island to suit its needs. The military occupied 52,000 acres of privately held land. To comply with the provisions in the Treaty of Paris, the military promised to pay rent, estimated at $120,000 per year, despite Congress's statement that it would not appropriate any more than $30,000. The military did not allow the citizens to rebuild homes or otherwise use their land, despite the fact that the military was neither using the land nor paying rent. The military government, composed of naval appointees, recognized this and advised the naval governor that this practice violated the rights of the people under Guam law. However, that did not stop the widespread practice of moving Chamorros off their land. As the Chamorros saw their land being taken without immediate compensation, they became suspicious of the U.S. government's motives for recapturing Guam. Their suspicions grew as they watched the military take control of more than 85,000 acres, amounting to 63% of all the land on Guam. It became immediately apparent that the U.S. could not possibly use all the land it was taking, and it was intended to control the lives of the Chamorros by depriving them of their sole source of sustenance. Now, I think the point I just wanted to make clear on the record, Mr. Speaker, that I think that some of this does stem from history, and the mover of the amendment is concerned about the future. But I think that was an important statement to make, because we don't have to look far in our history to see why, the people of Guam were very worried about increasing taxes that would in turn cause separation from the people and their land. Now, I think we have, many people wouldn't object, perhaps, to raising real property taxes because of the system that we have now with cash system. But however, I think that there is still a risk, Mr. Speaker, and like I said, I think that the way that this is written right now just disproportionately impacts those who have low income, who are not going to be able to come up with the increased cash needed for real property taxes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Vice Speaker. On the established amendment, any other senator wish to be heard? On the established amendment, Senator Morrison.
Mr. Chair, I just want to point out, I don't want to seem like I'm jumping too far ahead, but majority of the real property tax goes into TEF, the Territory Education Fund, and and seeing the adjustments made here in the TEF. So it will be safe to say that should this amendment pass, Department of Education, or there'll be automatically a corresponding cut to the Department of Education.
You are correct that in the appropriation to the Department of Education, we did use the TEF funds. If this amendment should pass, because of the priority that we have set with GDOE, though it would lose that TEF money, we would have to make it up in general fund by taking from other areas or by finding another source. In the same way that when we went from 5.5 to 5 in the business privilege tax, the farm fund went down, but in order to keep the 30 million going to the hospital, we had to augment it with more general fund appropriation. So there will have to be a shift, but initially, yes, you're correct, that the TEF money was going to be used for education.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just spoke to the author of the amendment, and I think he's prepared to discuss where those cuts will come from or make up for, so thank you.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the Esteves amendment as it relates to real property? Any other senator? If not, you're welcome to close.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, and I would ask my colleagues to please support this amendment. I think the long-lasting consequences of opening this door and looking this as a relevant funding source. And back to my previous statement, at the end of the day, a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. But when we pull it from such a crucial source, on Guam, taxing land is like taxing water. And if we're prepared to increase taxes on some of the most basic necessities, it's going to be a sad day. So I really hope that we don't go down this route. I think I'm prepared to look to make the cuts of an additional $23 million to make up the difference for what we would lose in the property tax. I can already think of a couple of different places, and I look forward to continued work with my colleagues on this measure and ask them for their support. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I beg your indulgence if I may say something on this. And again, it was something that just kind of filtered into my brain what the previous speaker had said, that the funds, if we do away with this increase in property taxes, they would affect the TEFF, the Territorial Education Facility Fund. And the response was yes, and then we would just have to figure out where to get that extra money because we are prioritizing education. And that the same speaker, our colleague, then said that the mover of this amendment was prepared to talk about where those adjustments would be made. Somehow, it seems in my mind only appropriate that we would need to understand where those amendments or where those changes
Point
would
of order,
be made.
Mr. Chair. I believe the proffer of the amendment already closed, so I'm wondering what the rules are.
I understand, and he apologized for interjecting, and
Right.
if I
can just get
So
to the
he
point.
should not have the floor, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, we're talking about a budget that has the overall ramification. If this amendment passes, we need to know then exactly what other places the cuts will be made, because we don't know that if the cuts are made to those other agencies, how critical that would affect those particular agencies. Because we're talking about $27 million worth of cuts, on top of the $57 million of cuts that we're already making in this budget.
I agree, and we'll have to deal with that when we get to it. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You may.
Thank you, Mr.
Close.
Speaker. I think the interest here is that I'm in a position where I need to put myself out there on what to cut. But let me just be I'll be prepared once we get to those portions in the budget We could be here all day working those amendments, but that's not the way that you've structured this budget. I think once we establish what the revenue is, then we could make the adjustments as we go page by page and deliberate on those. But to be very clear, Mr. Speaker, as far as cuts go, considering I've been very adamant about 237 and those cuts, I don't think it's going to be a problem for me to propose and make many proposals to further cut this budget, and hopefully find something on the back end that we could actually invest into something that's going to have long-term benefit to our government, instead of dumping more into payroll with no long-term returns, fiscal returns for the government or the taxpayer. So again, I'll be prepared as we move forward, but I think we need to dispose with this amendment first. Thank you.
You're correct. All right. All those in favor, the question now is the Esteves amendment as it relates to striking the real property tax section in section 2. All those in favor of the Esteves amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. The amendment passes. At this point, I'm going to ask that we recess until tomorrow morning. I'd like for OFB to, we're going to have to regroup, try to figure out whether or not in the morning I propose an increase in the hotel occupancy tax as I had heard earlier, or the hotel occupancy plus the alcohol tax. I'll have to think about that. The amendment to strike the business privilege tax has succeeded, and so we're going to have to try to regroup and figure out where the cuts will come or where increased and enhanced amount will help. All right, so we stand in recess until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Mr. Speaker, just a correction. It was the amendment to strike the property taxes, not the business privilege taxes.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's to
Thank you.
strike the real property tax provision in section 2. It has succeeded by a vote of 9 to 6. The committee will have to try to figure out where it goes from here. All right? Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Just for the record, what is the real property? What is anticipated revenue?
23.
23. Okay, thank you.